asking the question, God, what breaks your heart and my heart? That's a dangerous question, because once you
Mm.
find an answer to that, now all of a sudden it's like, if what breaks my heart is broken families, you all of a sudden might become foster parents. So I would say it's easy to focus on the destination versus that process of just becoming who God desires you to become.
Welcome to the Daron Earlewine podcast, where we awaken you to become who you were born to be. Here's your host, Daron Earlewine.
Who's responsible for your story? It's a good question. The answer to it will make a pretty big difference. Welcome back to the Daron Earlewine podcast. Daron Earlewine, your host. Thank you so much for downloading another episode. We're cruising it right along. I believe this is episode 28. And today we're sitting down with Brennan McCurdy. You may have never heard of Brennan, but after this, you're going to want to be his friend. He is a pastor out in an executive pastor out in Sacramento, California. And if you're a fan of the podcast and have listened to the past at least 28 episodes or somewhere in between, he is. We're going triple shot with the staff of Faith Legacy Church out in Sacramento, California. Three of my dearest friends: Jeff Jennings, who was on the podcast, Mark Moore, one of my buddies from college, and then Brennan. They are three of the staff members out of this church. And one of the reasons I've had them all on here is their stories are great. I love them to death, but they have a ministry model there that I really, really love, where they're all bivocational and involved in different ventures than just church ministry. And I believe there's a model there that I hope would expand some people's imagination to the fact that you could be called to serve within God's church, within the kingdom of God in a local church, and still have other pursuits. That doesn't have to be your 100% full-time deal. And so I love what we're going to jump into with Brennan, and I'm so glad he took the time to be with us on the podcast today. I want to thank you guys once again for downloading, for sharing these episodes. We continue to see growth on the podcast, and it means a world to us. And we're in the process right now of looking for some folks that might want to advertise on the podcast. And so if you have a business that would benefit from advertising to an audience like ours, we would love for you to contact us. You can just contact me directly, Daron@blackbirdmission.com, or you can just direct message me on Instagram or whatever works. But would love to hear from you if that's something that you're looking into. And today, guys, we're going to talk about the question that I hit you with there earlier: is who's responsible to write your story? Here in a couple of weeks, I'm going to go on a writing retreat and begin the process of writing my first book. And I've always dreamed about being an author. I never thought it'd be something I would be able to do, and it wasn't something I necessarily felt like I was worthy enough to write a story. Didn't feel like maybe my story was something that was no one would want to read. And God's brought me through a lot of cool growth in that situation and in that journey. And now here in a couple of weeks, I'm going to start the process of writing my first book that, Lord willing, if everything works out, will be released before the end of 2021, and would love for you guys to get a copy when it's done. But here's the deal. Thinking about that I'm going to author a book. And think about this in this case. Who is responsible to write my book? I'm responsible to write my book. Why am I responsible to write my book? Well, because I'm the author of the book. And think about it this way: how unsettling or confusing or frustrating would it be if I came to you and told you, "Hey, write my book. Well, I want you to write my book." My guess is your question would be like, I don't know your plan for the book. I don't exactly know your story. I'm not really in control of what's happening around your life. I don't even actually know everything about your story. So I'll miss a bunch of stuff. Like, I'm going to feel really unsettled and really uncertain, and I'm going to be really anxious. And it's just going to be a huge stress ball if you expect me to write your book, Daron. And that makes total sense and would make no sense for me to do that. Well, as I was listening to the interview with Brennan, he's going to mention this scripture, and it got me thinking, is in the Bible in Hebrews chapter 12. You may know this passage in Hebrews 12 says this, 12:1 and 2. It says, "Therefore, since we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off every encumbrance and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with endurance the race set out for us." Okay, then he says this: "Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith." The author and perfecter of our faith. Jesus is the author of our faith. say it every week here on the podcast. You're created on purpose and for purpose. You didn't create yourself. You're not your author of your story. God thought you up. He dreamed you up. He created you. You were knit together in your mother's womb, and he is the author of your life and of your faith. So we talk so much, and I think there's so much passion and concern and sometimes stress put on of like, what is God's plan for my life? I got to figure this out. I don't want to screw up my life. And listen, I may have stoked some of those fires in you. I'm sorry if I did, because I get obsessed with that way too often. I don't want to miss God's plan for my life and my purpose. Like, God, what am I supposed to do? And what I'm realizing is that I'm misplacing who's the author. God's the author of my story, not me. And so it's not like God's coming into my life, into your life and going, hey, write my story for me. You see, if I tell you I'm writing a story, I'm writing a book, you don't have any anxiety or any stress. You go, sweet, can't wait to see how it unfolds. And I'm guessing that you trust me as the author of my story to write my story well. What if we could actually get to that place and begin seeing Jesus as who he says he is in the Bible, that he is the author, that we're the pages? What kind of peace might that bring you to the purposes unfolding in your life? You see, Brennan's going to unpack for you this crazy journey of how does he become this small town Michigan farm boy to being this pastor in California? How does him telling a friend, he's running cross country, he doesn't even like to run, has no idea why he was even on a cross country team. He's running cross country, and a buddy of his that's a Christian. Brennan didn't grow up in a Christian home at all, wasn't looking for God, was just on a cross country run for practice. And his buddy says, I'm frustrated because I can't find anybody to do devotions with me. Brennan didn't even know what devotions were. He's going to talk about this in the podcast. And he decides to be a good friend. He'll tell this buddy that he'll do devotions with him so he's not alone. And through that process, Brennan discovers Jesus in the pages of the Bible, the first person in his family to come to faith, accidentally doing devotions after a cross-country practice of a team he didn't even want to be on, right? And so you'll see in Brennan's story that it's like for him, if he were trying to make up his story and say, I guess I'm the author of what's going on here, all the stress that would bring for him, realizing, no, the reality is that Jesus faith of your story. And as you begin to trust him in it, that is the process that begins to unfold. Because here's the deal, guys. God is way, way more invested in you discovering his love and discovering your calling than you are. Let me say that again. I wanted to sink in for a second. God is way more invested in you discovering his love and your calling than you are. And you're like, I listen to the podcast every week. I mean, I've been telling people about it. I love it. I'm here because I want to know. I'm man on purpose for a purpose. I want to know the purpose of my life. I'm really invested. I've been reading a lot of books. I listen to a lot of podcasts. I'm here for it. I'm glad you are. But take your level of passion to discover God's purpose for your life and do 10x on that is how much God is invested in it and actually authoring the process, right? Like he's the author and perfecter of your faith because he was so invested in you understanding his love and his calling on your life. He actually sent his son, and his son, Jesus Christ, actually died for your sins so that you could discover and get connected to his love and allow him to begin to rewrite your story as you place the pages of your life before him. I want you to consider that, and I want you to allow it to inform the level of passion. Continue to be passionate to pursue God's call in your life. But maybe this can relieve some of the pressure that, listen, you're not the author, he is. Small town Michigan farm boy becomes pastor in California. Accidental devotions, right? Becomes the first person in his family to graduate from college to get a graduate degree. Is driven by this idea that he wants to change the legacy of his family, and God begins to put these things in his heart, and he walks towards that. What's your story? I don't know. I'm sure it's different. I'm sure it's different than Brennan's, but you're going to find commonality in what he shares. And I want to share the scripture, and we're going to jump into the interview. I've loved this scripture. I think maybe I've shared it here on the podcast before, but every time I read it, I get something new from it. And it comes from David. It comes from 2 Samuel. And David has just conquered some enemies in this huge battle. It actually shows up twice in the Bible. It's so good. It's twice in the Bible. It's here in 2 Samuel 22. And it's also in Psalm, I think it's 38. But David, he writes this. He says, but me he caught, talking about God. But me he caught. He reached all the way from sky to sea. He pulled me out of the ocean of hate, that enemy chaos, that void in which I was drowning. They hit me when I was down, but God stuck by me. He stood me up on a wide open field. I stood there saved, surprised to be loved. Gosh, I love that last statement. Right? David's not saying, I was in this situation, had all these enemies trying to attack me and all of this hate and this chaos around me. And then I figured out a way to defend myself and to make this happen. And I put myself up on a great place and I saved myself and I did it. And I'm so glad that I have figured out a plan for my life. Isn't that what he says? He says there's chaos around him, right? He says he's drowning. And then God catches him. He reaches all the way from sky to sea. He pulls him out of the ocean of hate and chaos, the void in which he was drowning. I don't know where you are right now. If you look back and you say, but this is a part of my story and this is a part of my story, that's okay. What I want you to know is that God is the one who can catch you. He can reach all the way from sky to sea and pull you out, and you can be surprised to be loved. And that may be right where you're at right now. And then it gets better. He says, God made my life complete when I placed all the pieces before him. When I cleaned up my act, he gave me a fresh start. Indeed, I've kept alert to God's ways. I haven't taken God for granted. Every day I review the ways he works. I try not to miss a trick. I feel put back together, and I'm watching my step. Listen to this here. God rewrote the text of my life when I opened the book of my heart to his eyes. So good. God rewrote the text of my life when I opened the book of my heart to his eyes. You see, he's the author, friend. You know what you are? You're the pages. And Brennan's going to encourage us exactly what David said here. He made my life complete, right? And when I became alert to his ways, when I stopped taking him for granted, when every day I review the way he works, of who he is and his character, and I draw closer to him, when I put the pieces of my heart, I'm the paper, right? I open the pages of my life and allow the author to write the new story, to put me back together. You need to be put back together. You concerned about what that next chapter of your life looks like? Listen, friend, you're not the author, and he's going to do a great job writing it. All you got to do is open the pages of your heart to draw near to him. And that's why I love the question that Brennan asked in this episode. You're going to hear him. I want to say it to you now, and then I want you to think about it as Brennan says it, because it's a game changer. He says God is more concerned about who I'm becoming to a greater capacity than what I'm doing. What kind of person are you becoming? You see, that's what happens when you allow yourself to be the pages of God's story and you draw close to him daily. You press into the relationship and you allow him to transform you by the renewing of your mind, and you become the kind of person that would willingly step into the next adventure that he's ready to write. It's a good question, friend. Let's spend some time in Brennan's story. Let it inspire us. Let it instruct us. God's the author of your story, friend. You're not, but you are the pages. Open up your heart, open up your eyes. Allow him to write something new in and through you as you listen to Brennan's interview. When we come back, I'll have a few more thoughts. I needed this one today. So good. All right. Enjoy this interview. We'll be back here shortly, right here on the Daron Earlewine podcast. Hey, excited to sit down with my good friend, Brennan McCurdy. And Brennan, you're in Sacramento, California, and you're an executive pastor out there, Faith Legacy Church, great church in the Sacramento area. You're also a dad. got 3 girls. We got to talk about that. I got 3 boys. You got 7, 5, and 3. That's a completely different world than I have could ever imagine with my 3 boys. But you're an executive pastor, but you're also an entrepreneur. You've got a really cool kind of home-based tech company that you started that I also want to talk about. But I'm excited about your story, man. I think it's going to unlock an imagination for a lot of listeners of what God could do in our life if we'll just trust Him with our journey. So thanks for being on the podcast, Brennan.
Thanks for having me, Daron. And honestly, I love being able to jump in and have the opportunity to share my own story, but honestly, to hear a lot of other people's stories that you've shared on here, it's been really exciting and kind of eye-opening. So thanks for diving in and caring about other people's stories, dude.
Absolutely, Brennan. Good stuff, man. So, as I read through a little bit of your story, Brennan, where I want to take it, it brought me back to a story that I love, that I tell a lot when I go out and speak, actually in corporate settings. But there's a quote from Michelangelo, the artist, not the Ninja Turtle, although we could probably get some good Ninja Turtle quotes as well, but not for this podcast. But Michelangelo said this. He said, "The great danger for most of us lies not in setting our aim too high and falling short, but in setting our aim too low and achieving that mark." And the interesting thing about Michelangelo is, and I didn't know this before I read one of Jeff Goins' books, and he talked about that most of Michelangelo's life, he believed that he was from a disenfranchised aristocrat family, and that he had to redeem the honor of his family, and that narrative, the story that he told himself about himself, it fueled a lot of his passion for achievement. The interesting thing is, it was a lie. It wasn't true. He was believing a lie about himself. Yeah. And what I always tell people is, from that story, what I see is it doesn't really matter whether the narrative you believe about yourself is true or not. It just matters whether or not you believe it. Yep. And when you look at your journey, I think a lot of people maybe could find themselves in your journey, in your roots. And I think it would have been very easy for you to tell yourself a story as far as what you could accomplish because of your family upbringing or the town you came from, or the academic, lack of academic achievement from your family. Sure. But you didn't. And so I want to unpack that and just figure out, where did you and how did God lead you to begin to tell yourself the truth about yourself, about who God has created you to be. And so let's go from the beginning, man. You're in Sacramento now, but you're a Michigan guy, right?
I am born and raised in Michigan. Yeah. And I miss it too, believe it or not. I miss the Midwest. I miss the growing up on a farm. Like, I never in a million years imagined that I would live in the suburbs of a big city of Sacramento. I remember moving out here the first week. I moved into this little 700 square foot apartment, and I heard a helicopter outside. And I'd never heard a helicopter anywhere near my house in Michigan. And I remember going outside, and there was a spotlight from the helicopter, and they were shining around the neighborhood, and they had a megaphone on the helicopter, and they said, "Please get indoors. We're looking for a man." And they gave out a description. I'm like, where did I move to? Where is this place? Like, I mean, I grew up where you could leave your keys in the ignition and your windows down, and you knew everyone in town. And so I was never afraid of losing anything. If I leave my car unlocked now, I'm almost guaranteed to wake up to it being disheveled and come through in the morning, which is crazy. So, yeah. But I love the idea of that voice in your head and the story you tell yourself, even if it is a lie. And I think that one of the most important voices that we have, that we don't pay a lot of attention to, is our own. And our own voice is the most important voice that we have. And so a lot of times it's just a voice that's kind of up there, and it's either telling us lies or telling us truths. And many times that's based on family narrative or upbringing. And so I was raised in a really small farm town of 1,000 people. I mean, I was, felt like I was related to half of them, and you knew everything that went on. It was a small farm town just outside of Lansing, and it's called Weberville. And it actually wasn't even a town. Like, when you went into the town, it was called Welcome to the Village of Weberville. And so one barber shop, one light, really small. and didn't grow up in the greatest of homes. I had an amazing mom and an amazing dad. They got divorced when I was 5. And so grew up kind of in a broken home. I would see my dad every once in a while, but not often. And my mom would predominantly raise me and my 2 brothers who were younger and my sister. And I think my mom at the time probably made like $22,000 a year. And so that's what we lived off of. And I didn't really know any different. I didn't know that we grew up poor until later in life. That was our reality. And so,
yeah.
But I knew that growing up in a broken home was hard. And so seeing my parents argue and being separated, I mean, you think multiple Christmases is a great thing coming from a split home, but it's not. I mean, it's actually like more drama than anything. And so also didn't grow up in a Christian home at all. And so by the time I was 17, one of my best friends was a Christian, and his parents are amazing prayer warriors. And so we were running cross country one day, and in the middle of running the race, he was, usually we talk during the races because I hated running. So I have no idea why I even signed up for cross country. I don't even know why I'm here. So I would always try and have a conversation. And so during that conversation, he was sharing how he was frustrated about not having someone to do devotionals with him. And I was kind of just doing the best friend thing at this point and just said, hey, man, I'll do devotionals with you. I didn't even know what devotionals were at this point in my life.
Maybe it was like an after like run workout stretching routine.
Yeah, I was like, oh, cool. We're going to hang out and talk. Great. That sounds really simple. And I could tell he was frustrated. So I was like, I'm just being a best friend, And so, and I had in the home I had grown up in, like, obviously with the climate of being low income and being in a separated situation. And I had learned to grow up really early and try and help my mom out. And so, I was a good kid for the most part. Like I had good moral values, and I can only attest those to having to grow up so fast. So I wasn't a partier. It wasn't, I didn't take that path. And so, so I showed up to his house for devotionals, and he hands me this giant book, and I'm like, what is this? And I can still picture the cover of the book. It's a teen study Bible. And
in my brain, I think I can see it as well. Like I can see the teen study Bible.
Yes. And so we sit, we're up in his room, we sit on the bed, and we just start, we open the book of Matthew, and we just start reading. And the only thing that I can attest it to is the Holy Spirit in that moment just made everything clear to me. Like we were reading the gospel, and all of a sudden, a lot of the questions I've been asking about why my situation was the way that it was, or why I grew up, or like the moral ideal that I wanted to live in my life. Like all of a sudden, like a lot of answers started to becoming clear based on reading the story about this guy named Jesus. And everything just clicked. Like everything just made sense. And once I heard that story, I had the thought, like, why have I not been doing this my entire life? Why have I not been trying to live like Jesus my entire life? It would have been so much better. So from that point, we, our youth group at the time, he took me to his youth group. And at the time there was like, 6 kids, which that's a healthy percentage of the town. And so we all of a sudden, like our youth group started to explode because I was, once you experience God for the first time, there's this urgency and excitement that you can't contain. And so you just want to share it with everybody, and you just want to tell everybody about this hope and freedom. And so our youth group exploded to like 30, 40, 50 kids, and it was awesome. And then this same best friend said he was going to a college called Indiana Wesleyan University. And I was on a path to go play D1 basketball. I was being recruited by Central Michigan. And that was like my hope and dream. I think it's every high school athlete wants to go play pro sports. So I ended up visiting IWU with him. And all of a sudden I found out there was this job called a youth pastor. And I was like, you're going to pay me to hang out with kids and teach them about Jesus. And so I followed my heart and just said, basketball is a long shot and it's such a short window. I could go make an impact in kids' lives. If only someone would have told me sooner about this Jesus, like my life would have drastically changed. So ended up at IWU, and then out of college, miraculously got a call from this little church in Sacramento, California, where they were looking for a youth pastor. And I graduated in 2008, so it was right as kind of that housing economic crash was really starting to happen. And luckily, I got a job out here. And this church is filled with a staff of people who've become family for us. We have no family out here. And currently married, my wife, Amy, 11 years now. And then we've got 3 little girls. And man, let me tell you, that has been a really good challenge for me as a dad to raise 3 girls, because predominantly my house was boys with sports. My sister came along later, but it was all boys, all sports, and all fighting. So it's been a really good challenge to adjust to raising girls, because there's just a lot of estrogen in my house. So.
Brennan, let's go back to, you go through Indiana Wesleyan. It's cool. That's actually my alma mater. I was there and graduated in 2000. And we went different directions, because I grew up in Arizona and then came all the way to Indiana to go to college. You were in Indiana and went all the way to Sacramento to go back to life. But that was a pretty huge accomplishment. Like, let's not skip that, right? As far as you were first person to do that in your family.
Yeah. So up to that point, most of my family, one of the greatest things that my family gave me was hard work. Everybody, when you grow up on the farm, you work hard. And so I remember doing a couple roofs with my mom's boyfriend at the time. And I thought, I don't want to do this ever again. This sounds terrible. And so going and getting an education and investing in students was a big deal. So first in my family to go and get a bachelor's degree. And then a few years after that, ended up going to Gonzaga and got a master's degree in organizational leadership, which was a huge blessing and honestly just taught me how to lead people better, frankly. So both first for my family. And then my sister, she's 9 years younger than myself. She actually ended up moving in with my wife and I when she was 14 and a half. So 10 months into our first year of marriage, we took my sister in and raised her. And she's now the second person in our family to go to college. And she's now working on her PhD for counseling. So,
wow.
Yeah, really cool.
I mean, is that something you see, Brennan, that, do you ever think about if you hadn't had taken the risk, if you hadn't had, hadn't had kind of forged out in a new frontier for your family, the way that could have negatively impacted your sister or your family in different ways?
Yeah, absolutely. So there could have been a lot of different paths, that I took. And one of the things growing up that motivated me the most when we talk about, the story you're telling yourself, the story I told myself mostly growing up was, that's not something I want for my kids. And that's not something I want for my family. I don't want to have to think about where the next meal's coming from, or I don't want to have to think about where I'm spending Christmas this year. And so I was pretty committed to trying to build a lifestyle and change the generational impact. And I didn't even know Jesus was a piece of that, right? I was trying to do this outside of a relationship with Jesus at first. I was going to create a better life. And thankfully, along the way, the Holy Spirit got in my way and said, the best life that you can have is with me. And so now it's about trying to build a life that is answering the question, what breaks my heart the most? That determines occupationally, which is why I'm a pastor right now. And then at the end of the day, where can we as a family have the most impact for Jesus? So I think that the story that I continually tell myself was based off of a rough and difficult situation. And it's now led me to build a life or attempt to build a life that now my girls and my grandkids and their kids, when we look at the McCurdy family tree, I want them to be able to point to, this was the moment that things shifted and turned around. This was the moment that Jesus entered the equation into the McCurdy family. And since that, in this church out in Sacramento, my mom, my sister-in-law, my dad have all come to know Jesus in the walls of this church when they've come out to visit, which is amazing. So it's really cool. And so just trying to think about this from a big picture, 20, 30, 40 years from now, like how are we building something that my girls are going to stand on our shoulders and stand on the progress that we've made in a building of faith and changing people in our circles. And so I think that the story you tell yourself, the bigger it gets, the more impactful and powerful it gets. So,
Brennan, what I love about it is how random, but like not random it is, right? Because it's like,
yeah,
the idea of, how do I not miss God's plan for my life or whatever, but realizing like how invested in finding us God is, right? Because it's like,
absolutely.
oh, dude, I totally randomly went to a Bible study when I was 17, but it's like, it wasn't random to him. Like he knew what he was doing to actually completely change, your entire family tree for generations.
Yep. Yeah. And I think God's plan is a little tricky too. And I think we get this wrong a lot as men and women of God because we're so concerned with the will of God. I don't necessarily think that God's plan is like this GPS or like a location that we're supposed to end up to. I think of God's plan more about who I'm becoming versus necessarily a location of where I'm going. And so God is more concerned with the person that I'm becoming, because then the location, at that point, it could potentially be irrelevant, because if I am becoming the person that God has desired me to become, I'm going to have impact anywhere I go. And it seems incredibly random. I was this close to winding up in the military after college. We were visiting Washington, D.C. on a trip.
Brennan, before you tell that story, let me go back. Is that focusing more on who you're becoming rather than the exact plan? Is that freeing?
Absolutely, because we are so destination focused. It's like where we'll joke a lot of times, like where God calls you to. Like don't say that, or God will call you there. We focus so much on the environment, on the external, that we forget so much about the internal, right? So it's incredibly freeing to just know that God's going to use me wherever I'm at. If I'm so focused on just the person that I'm becoming, whether I'm in Sacramento, whether I'm in Indiana, or a little small town in Michigan, it's incredibly freeing, because it takes all the pressure off of like, I need to go here, I need to do this. And so I think does God call us to places? Absolutely. But we get so hung up on that we forget about the importance of that inside work. And I always try and remind the people at our church, the most important work you'll ever do in your life is on the inside. It's the inside work that's hard. It's the emotional IQ work. It's the tough questions, asking the question, God, what breaks your heart and my heart? That's a dangerous question, because once you find an answer to that, now all of a sudden it's like, if what breaks my heart is broken families, you all of a sudden might become foster parents. So I would say it's easy to focus on the destination versus that process of just becoming who God desires you to become.
I think those two questions, Brennan, they form they form kind of the parallel lines to write, or allow God to write a different story for you, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that while you have so much freedom in becoming whoever God wants you to become, it also gives you guidelines. It also gives you some lines in the road where it's like, does God want me to go here? Does God want me to go there? And as a pastor, that's a question that people are constantly asking. And it's not a bad question, but the freedom that comes with, like, what's God doing in you right now? Because we always want to skip to the destination. We don't necessarily want to do the work in the process, but it's incredibly freeing. But at the same time, it gives you some good parameters to live your life.
Give us those two questions again, Brennan. So what is it now? Where the world's greatest need? How did you say it?
Yeah. So what breaks your heart, and what breaks God's heart? Because there are a lot of things I think that we see that breaks God's heart in the Bible, but when you ask the question, what breaks your heart? That's a better question to frame when you're trying to figure out what the next step is, maybe occupationally, or what you and your family are going to do. My wife and I have this conversation all the time. We ask ourselves, what breaks our heart right now? Because what we want to do is align the giftedness that God has given us and the blessings, whether it's financial resources or the gifting that we have. We want to align that with the thing that breaks our heart the most, so that we can make the most progress there. We want to move the ball down the field. And whether it's sex slavery or homelessness here in Sacramento or clean water overseas, whatever it might be, something breaks your heart. And so figuring that out, rather than asking, where's the next place God's calling us to? Or what's the next thing? It's like, those are such big picture questions that a lot of times we end up spinning in our head those questions for years, and we never really make any progress. So what breaks your heart is a question that we're constantly trying to ask ourselves as a church.
I think that's huge, Brennan. And I think it's counterintuitive, because I think like we talk here on the podcast every week, I say the same thing, that God has created you on purpose and for a purpose. And that, we do talk a lot about pursuing, plan, understanding the unique ways God's created us. But I think a lot of people, it's that for a purpose piece. I think a lot of people, they don't get their eyes high enough on the horizon, where a lot of times their purpose is pleasure. It's a good time. It's happiness. You know what I mean? And so the question is not what breaks my heart that I could go and actually join God in. It's just, what do I want to do? What makes me happy?
Yeah.
What can, and what I've experienced, and I'd love for you to unpack this, is that for me, like, my greatest joy is always found in the process of going after something that we can join God in redeeming, that we can join God in the process. And I still experience the best of life, but I feel like anytime that I go after, like, this is really what I want, or I want to do this to make myself happy, or to ease my own pain, or whatever it is. Maybe it's momentarily. I'm not saying it's not fun sometimes, but it doesn't fill the soul, right?
Yeah. I think we're incredibly capable as people. And I, on my own, could cultivate a good life, could create happy moments, could create even probably some fulfilling moments. And so I think at the end of the day, you and I both have an understanding that there's something deeper, there's something bigger, and that there is joy to be found in the deepness of our soul. That's really hard to explain. And I think that this ultimately will be fulfilled in heaven. And so, but the goal is for the kingdom to invade earth, right? And so I want to bring the kingdom here. And so in this process, in understanding joy the way that you and I do, I can ask myself, like, what's best for me and my family? And we, again, could cultivate some good moments. But if we change that framework just a little bit and shift it and start to ask hard questions, that what breaks my heart, and how do I really find joy in this world? Ultimately, we're always going to come back to serving and helping people. And there's no greater joy than serving or helping people. I've never heard someone regret helping people. There's always ungrateful people that you help, and it's frustrating that you wish they were more grateful. But at the end of the day, it's the most fulfilling thing that I do as a pastor, is to go and to serve and to love people. And so, and the interesting thing is that's something my family did without the story of Jesus. If you were to know anybody in my family, they're the most generous people. They help people. I could call my dad right now and tell him I have a flat tire, and he'd drive from Michigan to here to help me out. Right. But when you combine the idea of serving and loving people with the idea of Jesus, now you're really excited and fulfilling the greatest commandment at that point. And so now you can feel fulfillment. Now you can get excited about things. And so it's fascinating, the things that people pursue for joy. And you can read all the statistics about, people's pursuit over money. And one article I was reading was that typically anybody who makes more than $75,000, $75,000 was considered the baseline for being able to fulfill, living, food, all those things. Anybody who makes more money than that, at that point, money is not going to be a factor in your pursuit for joy. Anybody making less than that, money is going to be a factor, because they're trying to figure out their basic necessities like food and housing. And it's like it's going to make a big impact. But anybody making more than that, and this was kind of a baseline statistically what the average person needs to make. So we attach joy to money all the time. And so, but anybody who's got their needs met already, like if you're going to experience joy on a deep level, it's always going to be giving something away, generosity, time, serving people. And so joy is just as tricky and as it is to find as is God's will.
So good, dude. So good, Brennan. Listen, I want to end today, and I haven't done this for a long time, but I feel like that you're the kind of guy that will give us some nuggets. I used to always ask this at the end of the podcast, and for some reason I've just forgotten to ask it, but I used to call it the lightning round, and it was really simple, but I wanted to know, it's really simple. It's not as cool as it sounds. I want to know a band, a book, and a movie that have greatly impacted your life, so we can get some resources out of you. What's a band, a book, and a movie that has impacted your story?
Okay. A band. Can I give two?
Sure.
Perfect. So we're going to band that deeply impacted my life, just because it was the first live concert I ever went to, was Jimmy Eat World. First live concert. But then also band wise, like I have fallen in love with David Gray over the years. I just love David Gray, and there's probably a lot of emotional memories attached to that. A book that
was he, where is he from, Michigan?
No, I wish. That'd be awesome.
Okay.
Yeah.
I can't remember where he's from.
No,
okay.
I think he's overseas.
Okay, cool. Yeah, you're right. That's right. I'm thinking of somebody else.
Yeah. So there have been so many books, man. I'm trying to think of the most recent. I'll give you the most recent, and it's called Emotionally Healthy Relationships. It's a day-by-day book by Pete Scazzaro. It's a 40-day journey to emotional health, and it's really great. It's fantastic. If you haven't picked it up or read it yet, it's really, really good. And then what was the last one? Band, a book,
a movie.
A movie. Oh man. Let's see. Man, one of my favorite movies growing up was A River Runs Through It. And it's a fly fishing movie. It's an old school, but I think because it was a story about how two brothers always fought and eventually got to redemption, that it was inspiring for me. So, yeah.
I love it, dude. Brennan, I love the grassroots beginnings of your story, and also and just it's so comforting to me, and I hope it is to our listeners, that it doesn't matter where we start or how random we think our journey is. It's like God is there, and he's seeking after us. And I love the fact that the biggest part of joy and fulfillment that he's inviting us into is the relationship, right? In that process of
Absolutely.
who we're becoming. And then the joy comes in joining him in what he's doing. And yeah, the cool part is sometimes that adventure takes us to Sacramento, and sometimes it keeps us right back in Michigan.
Right.
But it's when we begin to trust him, right? Uh, that's why I love the script that talks about that he's the author, and
Yeah.
perfecter of our faith. It's like when we trust him with the story, not only does he lead us in a story of truth, but it's a story that we could never write for ourselves. But
Mm.
it's always such an amazing adventure, man.
And it's messy, dude. That's the hardest part, right? Like, it's messy. The gospel is messy. And like
Hmm.
when Jesus says, love the least of these, he doesn't like define who that is. It's like, so it's messy. And that's the hard part about all this stuff. It's like it's just a messy process. So
Hmm. Brennan, if people want to stay connected to you, what's the best way for them to do that?
yeah, IG, you can just look me up on Instagram. You're going to get a lot of family stuff, a lot of church stuff on there, but that's the place where I'm most active.
Rock and roll, dude. Brennan, thank you so much for the time, dude. Your story is inspiring. It's a good guidepost story, and thanks for sharing it with us today, dude.
Dude, thanks for having me.
And we're back all the way from Sacramento, California. You ever been to Sacktown? I have. Great place. They got In-N-Out Burger there. I've had a couple calls from my good friends there out in Sacramento. Mark Moore, alumni of the podcast, actually called me this week. And this week that we're recording this episode, it was 0 this morning when I woke up, and we got a foot of snow yesterday here in Indiana. Remember, I grew up in Arizona, so every time this happens, I want to figure out why in the world I still live here. Okay, I do. And I was talking to my neighbor, actually. I was helping my neighbor dig out one of her daughter's friends from a snowbank the other morning at like 7:30 in the morning. Way too cold to be doing any kind of good service, specifically snow-related. Anyway, I helped dig out the girl from the snowbank. And then I said to my neighbor, I said, it's days like this, I wonder why we live here. And then I noticed something is, she is an Indiana person. She's been here, a Midwesterner, her whole life. So this is the only context that she understands weather. And so when I say that, I always say that because I realize that there's something better called the Valley of the Sun, Phoenix, Arizona, where it's basically sunny, 360 days of the year. You don't have snow and things of this nature. My wife grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina. Most of the time, really good weather in Charlotte. And so I say things like, I wonder why I still live here. And my neighbor who's from the Midwest says this, well, at least when it snows, we have something pretty to look at. And I almost bought into that logic. I was like, you're right. And then I went back inside and I couldn't feel my fingers. And I was like, this is something Midwesterners say to make themselves feel better about the fact that they can't feel their fingers and they had to dig a car out of a snowdrift. Okay, that's exactly what that was. Anyway, that has nothing to do with what we're talking about in this episode. So let's move on from there. Brennan, how good is Brennan's interview? Such good stuff. He hit us with those tough questions there at the end, didn't he? Right? Like, who are you becoming? What breaks your heart? And more than that, what breaks God's heart? So good. In this focus of focusing on who you're becoming more than what you're actually doing, Mark Moore talked about this as well, and it makes sense. They're partners out there and on staff at Faith Legacy, and they talk a lot about spiritual formation and about growing the spiritual depth of their community. And I love what they're doing. I love being a part of, even from a distance, what's going on at Faith Legacy. And this is where my thoughts went as I was thinking about that person of the idea of the kind of person you're becoming is. Do you guys remember the story that the big breaking scandal about that huge Christian leader that missed God's call in their life and missed that great opportunity to do something cool for God? Do you remember that one? Like, it made the headlines where it was like, pastor totally misses God's will for church. And then there's like another big, like tantalizing, like it really hit all the news stations about that one pastor, the mega church pastor, right? That just couldn't figure out, what the next plan was for God in their life. Do you remember that story? Neither do I. Because see, that story doesn't make headlines because it actually doesn't really ever happen because God is the author and the perfecter of our story. But do you remember the story of the youth pastor or the megachurch pastor or whoever it was that ruined their life because they had character flaws? Yeah, you do. Those stories hit the headlines all the time because what happens is we get way more concerned about writing our own story than the kind of person that we're becoming. And so we bet on charisma and we bet on competency and we fail in character. You see, we're the pages. He's the author. When we keep that correct, we'll keep the pages of our heart open, allow him to write his word and his truth and his love and the fruit of his spirit into our heart, and we'll become the kind of person that will naturally step into the story and to the call that God has in our life. But we have to have it in the right place. And so there's a question to ask, who are you becoming? Right now, you listen to the podcast because you want to know the next job. You want to know if you should go to college. You want to know if you should marry him. You want to know this. You're looking for direction. I'm glad you're here. I'm not saying stop listening to the podcast, but what I'm asking is, how much time are you placing in asking the question, what kind of person am I becoming? Am I becoming the kind of person that stays so close to the author that it's very easy for him to write a new chapter in my life? You'll know you are when what is breaking your heart are the same things that are breaking God's. That's why he tells us that when we delight ourselves in him, that he will give us the desires of our heart, because what happens is his heart begins to be our heart. We have the mind of Christ. We have the heart of God, his Holy Spirit guiding and directing and teaching us inside. And we begin to desire the things that are in his heart. Our heart begins to break for the things that his heart breaks for. And then we move out and we start thinking about changing the legacy of our family, not just like financially or something, but for the difference they're making. And that's, I love Brennan's heart with this. So there's your questions as we walk away from this podcast. What breaks your heart the most? Where can your family have the greatest influence for Jesus? Such a good question. Who are you becoming? What breaks your heart? What breaks God's heart? There are your 3 questions for your takeaway for today's podcast. It's really, really good. Another thing that I thought about that I want to leave you guys with before we're done is right as I was finishing the last notes for this episode, I went back to, the kind of the purpose statement that I say every week here on the podcast, right? That you're made on purpose and for a purpose. And I believe that's absolutely true. But I heard it a little bit different as I was writing it this time, that maybe it needs to be like this, that you're made on purpose for God's purposes, right? You're made on purpose for God's purposes. And I think when we get that in the right order, we realize that our purpose is always found in the midst of God's purposes. But the opposite is not always true. God's purposes are not always found in our purposes. And we get that backwards when we try to be the author and act like he's the page. You are made on purpose for God's purposes. He's the author. You're the page. Open your life to him. All right, friends. If you need a little next step in the unique way that you are created to fulfill his purposes, head over to spiritualdna.me right now. Spiritualdna.me, an online course that will awaken you to become who God's created you to be. You'll step into that character process. You'll step into that discovery process to find your peace and your passion, your purpose, wrapped up in the purposes of God. Spiritualdna.me. Go check it out. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week. Please share, comment, post, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And love you. Thanks for hanging out. Would love to hear from you. You can text me 317-550-5070 or email me, Daron@blackbirdmission.com, and we'll talk to you next week. But before then, never forget, God's for you, not against you. He's near you, not far from you. For from you, far from you. and He's created you on purpose and for a purpose. Thanks for hanging out right here on the Daron Earlewine Podcast.